Welcome to Le Weekend, your essential roundup of French news on culture, business, the economy, and current affairs. We bring you a convenient way to catch up on the stories from the past week in France, plus an additional focus feature blending reportage and cultural context. These are the headlines for Monday, January 12th. France's finance ministry has received no request seeking investment approval in French biotech Abivax and has had no contact with Eli Lilly, according to a statement by a ministry official on Monday, after a media reported that the US pharma giant was still interested in buying the company, as reported by Reuters. The Louvre Museum in Paris closed on Monday due to a strike from the staff who have gone on strike several times during the past weeks already over pay and working conditions, as reported by Reuters. French far-right leader Marine Le Pen begins a crucial appeal in Paris this week that will determine whether she can run in the 2027 presidential election after being barred from public office over a conviction for misusing EU funds, as reported by Radio France. Bernard Arnault was installed at the Academy of Moral and Political Sciences. The CEO of the world's #1 luxury goods company, LVMH, succeeds Denis Kessler, former chairman of the reinsurer SCOR, who died in June 2023, as reported by France Info. The headlines on Tuesday, January 13th. The dates of the next G7 summit in Davos, being organized by France, have been changed to accommodate Donald Trump's schedule, according to a U.S. official cited by Agence France-Presse. The U.S. president is due to celebrate his 80th birthday on June 14th by hosting an MMA fight at the White House, so the G7 will now run from June the 15th to the 17th, as reported by RFI. Ex-Corsican nationalist leader, soccer club president Alain Orsoni, was shot dead at his mother's funeral. Orsoni was one of the leaders of the Corsican National Liberation Front in the 1980s and later founded and led the Movement for Self-Determination, as reported by Le Monde. Hundreds of tractors rolled into Paris as farmers protest the European Union-Mercosur trade deal. Over 350 tractors rolled into Paris for the second time in a week on Tuesday to protest the trade deal, which is due to be signed over the weekend. French farmers' unions said the deal threatens local agriculture by creating unfair competition with cheaper South American imports, as reported by RFI. Paris launched the major project for the renovation of Montparnasse. Architect Renzo Piano unveiled his new renovation plan for the shopping center, with construction aimed to start in 2028, as reported by Le Monde. France's emission cuts remain off track for climate goals. While still declining, the reduction in greenhouse gas emissions in France slowed for the second consecutive year in 2025, according to data communicated on Tuesday. The estimated 1.6% reduction means that at its current pace, France is not on track to meet its long-term target of carbon neutrality by 2050, as reported by Le Monde. The headlines on Wednesday, January 14th. The French government survived 2 no-confidence votes over the Mercosur trade deal. French Prime Minister Sébastien Lecornu's government survived a second vote of no confidence in the National Assembly that had been called in protest against the trade deal, as reported by Reuters. France is looking into sending Eutelsat satellite terminals to Iran to help citizens after Iranian authorities imposed a blackout of internet services in a bid to quell the country's most violent domestic unrest in decades, as reported by Reuters. French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot said that France will open a consulate in Greenland on February 6, a move that had been planned since last year amid the US President Donald Trump's push to take control of the Arctic territory, as reported by RFI. These are the headlines for Thursday, January 15th. Consumer prices in France rose 0.7% year-on-year in December, according to Statistics Office ANSEE, matching the preliminary reading published earlier this month, as reported by Reuters. 50 French farmers were arrested after storming the Agricultural Ministry building in Paris. Around 100 members of the Confédération Paysanne Union entered a section of the ministry which they occupied for an hour to denounce the government's agricultural policies, as reported by Le Monde. President Macron said that France will send more forces to Greenland. During his New Year's address to the armed forces at Istres Air Base in southern France, President Macron said France would deploy additional land, air, and maritime assets to Greenland in the coming days, as reported by Le Monde. The headlines on Friday, January 16th. Our report found that the Benedictine nuns of Montmartre in Paris lived under duress for 40 years. An independent investigation commissioned by the congregation revealed that Mother Marie-Agnès, the congregational prioress general, ruled through an atmosphere of terror and suspicion. The control of food and of women's weight was central to the superior's domination, as reported by Le Monde. France's government is looking at forcing through the budget after talks stalled. France's government suspended talks in parliament on its 2026 budget until Tuesday after lawmakers failed to reach a compromise, giving the prime minister time to consider options for forcing through the legislation without a vote, as reported by Reuters. The government proposed a series of measures to ease the doctors' crisis that led to the current strike. After several days of demonstrations, the executive hopes to revive discussions with the profession by modifying several contested measures, notably including abandoning mandatory prescription reduction targets set by the National Health Insurance System, as reported by Le Figaro. The region of Île-de-France around Paris will launch a regional car-sharing service in 2027. The region launched a call for tenders by the end of 2026 for a self-service vehicle service intended for short and medium-term loop rentals, meaning that the vehicles will be picked up and returned to the same place, as reported by Le Figaro. You are listening to Le Weekend. Now that you're all caught up with the headlines from the past week, it's time for our feature story. Today we look at why Corsica made the news this week. On Monday afternoon, in the village cemetery of Vero, Corsica, 71-year-old Alain Orsoni was shot dead by a long-range sniper while attending his mother's funeral. Father Roger Dominique Polge, who had just finished conducting the service, told France 3 Télévision that it was a moment of sorrow and grief. Suddenly, we heard a gunshot and Alain collapsed. The killing reads like something from a mafia thriller, but it is a window into one of Europe's most enduring political conflicts. Orsoni had been a leader of the Corsican National Liberation Front in the 1980s and founded the movement for self-determination in 1990. He had spent years of exile and, in fact, this week was just back from Nicaragua to bury his 91-year-old mother. France's newly formed National Anti-Organized Crime Prosecutor's Office has taken over the investigation, marking its first major case since launching just days earlier on January 5th. But Orsoni's story is merely the latest chapter in a tale of tension and resistance that stretches back more than 2.5 centuries to the moment when this Mediterranean island became, on paper at least, part of France. Understanding these tensions requires understanding of what's at stake. Corsica is what the ancient Greeks called Kaliste, meaning the most beautiful. The fourth largest island in the Mediterranean at 8,680 square kilometers, Corsica is nicknamed a mountain in the sea with more than 120 peaks exceeding 2,000 meters, making it the most mountainous Mediterranean island. These granite peaks plunge down to over 1,000 kilometers of pristine coastline, dotted with more than 200 beaches, from white sand crescents to hidden coves accessible only by boat. The island's natural splendor has become both a blessing and a curse. Tourism now accounts for nearly 40% of Corsica's regional GDP, compared to just over 12% in other French tourist regions, with the sector attracting 3.4 million travelers in 2022. Yet paradoxically, Corsica remains one of the poorest regions in France, with GDP per capita approximately 20% lower than the rest of the country. The contradiction is stark. An island of extraordinary beauty that generates enormous tourism revenue, yet cannot translate that into prosperity for its own people. This economic dependency on mainland France, combined with the transformation of coastal areas into second home destinations, fed into the tension. For many Corsicans, each luxury villa, each tourist development, each French administrator represents cultural erosion. Let's go back in time. The relationship between Corsica and France began not with conquest, but with a transaction. In 1768, Genoa officially ceded Corsica to Louis XV of France through the Treaty of Versailles, settling debts incurred after enlisting French military help in suppressing a Corsican revolt. What makes this particularly bitter for Corsican nationalists is that the island had actually won its independence. In 1755, following a revolution, the independent Corsican Republic was proclaimed under the leadership of Pascal Paoli. Paoli created what many historians consider a remarkably progressive government for its time. He drafted a liberal Corsican constitution, heavily influenced by Enlightenment ideas, and created one of the most extensive voting franchises in the world, attempting radical reforms in education and governance. For 14 years, this small Mediterranean island operated as its own nation. Then Genoa, unable to assert control of the Corsican Republic, simply sold their claim to the French. France dispatched a military expedition to Corsica in 1768 to secure French rule, eventually deploying between 18,000 to 20,000 men. At a decisive Battle of Pont-Neuf in 1769, French forces defeated the Corsican army, effectively ending organized resistance. Ironically, 1769 was the same year of the birth of Napoleon Bonaparte in Corsica. Both his parents had joined the local resistance and fought against the French to maintain independence. The boy who would become Emperor of France was born a citizen of a conquered nation, his parents having fought on the losing side. For nearly 2 centuries after annexation, Corsican identity simmered beneath the surface. The island retained many Italian cultural elements, with Corsican, an Italo-Dalmatian language closely related to Italian, remaining the native tongue alongside French. Corsicans participated in French society as administrators, soldiers, and civil servants, but the island remained poor, underdeveloped, and largely neglected by Paris. The modern nationalist movement has its roots in the 60s. A regionalist movement emerged seeking greater recognition of Corsican culture and language, but the catalyst that transformed regionalism into armed rebellion came in 1972 when an Italian company dumped toxic waste off the Corsican coast. Corsicans felt the French government had failed to protect them. In 1975, an armed standoff between French authorities and Corsican autonomists at a wine cellar turned violent. 2 gendarmes were killed, and the event marked the beginning of an armed conflict between French forces and Corsican nationalist groups. There were moments of peace. In 1981, a ceasefire held for the duration of the presidential elections, and the talks that followed resulted in the creation of a new territorial collectivity of Corsica. The 1990s saw the nationalist movement split into 2 organizations, the Habituels, pro-ceasefire, and the Historiques, that maintained a stance of armed struggle for total independence. The split led to a violent internal war that claimed dozens of lives. Into this bloody landscape stepped both Alain Orsoni and François Santoni. Orsoni's brother Guy, also a separatist militant, was assassinated in 1983. Santoni took a different path. In 1985, he was found guilty of terrorism for bomb attacks and sentenced to 8 years in prison, but was released a few years later following amnesty agreements. His war with rival nationalist guerrillas and his feud with the mafia made him state publicly that he knew of plots to kill him, and indeed, in 2001, as Santoni left a wedding, a group of men ambushed and shot him. But another assassination would prove even more consequential for Corsica's relationship with France. In 1998, Claude Erignac, the prefect of Corsica and the highest-ranking state representative on the island, was shot while walking to a classical music concert. The attack was so heavily criticized by locals that the FLNC was forced to deny responsibility, and support for independence reached an all-time low among the population at just 6%. Corsican nationalist Ivan Colonna was found guilty of the assassination and sentenced to life, and in 2022 was attacked in prison by another inmate and died from his injuries. Violent unrest broke out across Corsica, with thousands taking to the streets. For many on the island, Colonna had become a martyr for the nationalist cause. The French government's response, with then Interior Minister Gérald Darmanin saying that they are ready to go as far as autonomy, but insisted there would be no dialogue until the violent protests ended. Nationalist leaders have called for special status for Corsica, greater autonomy, equal status for the language alongside French, and amnesty for Corsicans jailed for violence in support of independence. Public opinion on the island is complex. Support for outright independence remains relatively low. Most Corsicans want more autonomy, not full separation from France. Corsica receives significant funding from France. Approximately 60% of the budget is state-funded, according to 2024 figures from statistics agency ANSEE. In July 2025, the French government offered Corsica autonomous status within France with powers set by a basic law under supervision of the French judicial system. Yet, even as politics have shifted toward negotiation, violence continues to haunt Corsica. The island was ruled by the Republic of Genoa from 1284 to 1755, far longer than it has been French. The island's culture, language, and traditions remain distinct. Corsican autonomy is more extensive than in other regional collectivities in France, and the Corsican Assembly is permitted to exercise limited executive powers. Yet, the relationship remains fraught. The island's economy depends heavily on tourism and French subsidies. What makes Corsica's story so compelling is that it refuses simple resolution. This is an island that was an independent republic, that has its own language and culture, that fought a decades-long armed conflict for autonomy, yet whose population remains divided on what they actually want. The bombs have largely stopped, but the violence has not. For now, the island exists in a state between French department and autonomous territory, between integration and independence. Thank you for listening to Le Weekend, your one-stop destination for the main headlines in France. Catch our weekly roundup every weekend wherever you get your podcasts. Stay informed.